Hello. I chose to do the article review on the article Questioning the Quality of Virtual Schools by Matthew M. Chingos. So, a little bit about virtual schools from the article. The article stated that the most dominantly enrolled population in virtual schools is white middle school students that are not enrolled in the free or reduced lunch program, that do not require special education services, and also that are primarily not English language learners. Also, virtual schools require that parents arrange for some sort of supervision for their children, whether that be a parent staying home from work or some sort of babysitting situation that they've set up. Also requires that students have access to technology in order to complete the program. Usually that would mean like a laptop or a computer, something that's not a tablet or a phone. So from some information from 2010 and 2011, there were reports that on average students in virtual schools did not do as well compared to students in traditional brick and mortar schools. Some of that information was collected about graduation rates. They said that only 49% of students in virtual schools graduated on time compared to 79% in traditional brick and mortar schools. And 2 to 11% of students scored lower in reading, and 14 to 36% of students scored lower in math on state proficiency exams in the virtual schools compared to the traditional schools. And I think that that math information is especially scary, or at least something, a red flag to be looked at. A little bit more information from the article that have to do with the reports on the quality of the schools. Some of the facts that they gave were talking about the different factors that affect the ability of researchers to get a clear picture of the quality of virtual schools. So most virtual schools are privately run and are for-profit, which I didn't know and I thought was interesting. And that affects the amount of data that can be publicly accessed about the schools and the programs, about the way they spend their money. Also, students are, as I said, are overwhelmingly not enrolled in free and reduced lunch programs, and those programs often provide more information about student demographics, and since those students are not enrolled, we would not have that information about their demographics. So these factors can affect our research results in a couple of different ways. One of them is because we don't have a lot of information about students, the student achievement is difficult to compare to how they would have otherwise done in their own local school. So we may have some information about student achievement in virtual schools, but we can't compare that information to how students similar to them do in their own school district. Also, the cost of teaching on a per student basis, although it was said to be lower for virtual schools, it can't be calculated very honestly or very helpfully, since the profit made by the company is not known, and we don't know some different ways that they spend their money, and a few other things that I'll get into here in just a minute. So, my thoughts on this article. One thing that I thought was interesting was the people who are calling for the access to virtual schools don't necessarily seem to be overlapping with the people who are enrolling for the virtual schools. At least according to what I was reading, it said that the virtual schools, the people who are calling for access to virtual schools are the people who can't afford to move to a better school district or can't afford a private school near them. However, the people who are enrolling in these programs tend to seem well off, as they're not in the free and reduced lunch program, well off white people that don't require a lot of services. So it seems like they might not be very low on the socioeconomic status, which I just thought was interesting. That didn't seem like the people who are enrolling are the same people that say that we should have more access to it. Also, something I kind of already noted is, do these students who are enrolling have access to technology? Is there a way to ensure that they will have the access to technology when they are enrolling? Is that something we should consider? Is that another factor we should add when trying to do this research and decide the quality of these programs? Do they have access to appropriate supervision? Is maybe the program isn't as much to blame as the students' access to technology, or maybe they aren't being supervised appropriately, so they're not getting their work done like they should be. Also, from my personal experience, knowing students at my school who have taken online courses, so this is not a full virtual school, but some online courses during the school day, they typically thought that their access to teachers and information was far lower than they get in a traditional classroom. Of course, the teachers aren't right there, but they just didn't feel as comfortable interacting in those classrooms online or with those teachers. It might be different if your whole experience was that way, but for them, they really didn't feel like they were getting as quality of an education. Something big that I thought about this article is that the data is old. 2010-2011 information is at least 7 years old, and when you're talking about technology, that is a lifetime. So it's hard to know if this information might have been different now, since the quality of the material that we have available online is drastically different than the quality of material that would have been available then. Even just the number of educational YouTube videos has changed dramatically. So because of that, new data might show that students have better access to information, which could affect their ability to succeed in a virtual school. So the article talked about that less money is spent on the virtual schools per student. Something that it didn't mention or consider, though, was that these virtual schools have fewer students with that are learning the English language, and fewer students who require special education services. And that can be expensive. Both of those things can. And so without as many of those students, of course, they're not going to have to spend as much on average per student. And that just was something that wasn't mentioned that I thought should be at least considered. Also, how much money that they spend translates to student success. Now, this kind of goes into my next thing. We don't have a lot of good information about if students are succeeding through virtual schools or not. Once we do, we can get some more information about, is the money that is being spent in virtual schools letting students succeed more? So is it really it's cheaper for a better outcome, or is it cheaper for a worse outcome, which isn't worth it? So we need some more information about student achievement before we can look exactly at how important the cost is. So that goes into just the lack of information. I kind of talked about that already, but because we don't have the access to student demographic information, not as much about the students that are involved in the virtual program, it's very difficult to compare those students' achievements to the achievements of what they would have done in their own school district. And really, without that information, it's really just not a fair comparison, the information we have. Right now we're comparing average student success to average student success in the virtual classroom compared to average student success in the traditional classroom throughout a whole state. So you could be comparing a student who has always performed under grade level because they have gone to a school district that did not support them in the way that they needed to be supported, to a student that goes to the best school in the state. Yeah, okay, so you're taking averages, but still, you're not comparing in an as detailed way as would really provide some better information, especially if the majority of the students enrolled in virtual schools are from a certain demographic. Then it's not really fair to compare those students to a blended demographic throughout a state. It doesn't give you good information. Also, the lack of long-term data is somewhat alarming. So often we, especially lately with MAP testing, we measure student success by growth. So if a student improves significantly from their previous year's scores on state testing, then we call that a win. But without knowing how these students in the virtual school have done on previous tests in previous years, it's difficult to know if they are improving or staying the same or losing some of their intellect or some of their knowledge. So that's my summary of this article. Basically, it comes down to we need more information to know for sure, at least according to this article. Thanks.